The ultimate nightmare of the early Cold War was the surprise attack. It was the fear that one morning, the Soviet Union would unleash its fleet of long-range nuclear bombers, and America would have no warning, no time to launch a response, no time to prepare the population, and certainly no time to run to those newly constructed backyard fallout shelters. This terrifying scenario created a political and military imperative. America had to buy itself time. The solution, conceived in the mid-1950s, was an engineering marvel and a monument to national anxiety: the Distant Early Warning Line, or the DEW line. The DEW line was an audacious, massive, and incredibly expensive military construction project that stretched over 3,000 miles across the most inhospitable, desolate terrain on Earth, the Arctic Circle. This vast chain of radar stations, stretching from the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, across the northern territories of Canada to Greenland, was designed for one purpose: to provide the U.S. and Canada with a maximum of 3 hours warning of an incoming Soviet bomber attack passing over the North Pole. 3 hours. That was the precious yield America sought to purchase with billions of dollars and years of labor. The project was born out of intense urgency following two major intelligence shocks. First, the Soviet Union successfully detonated its own atomic bomb in 1949, ending the U.S. nuclear monopoly. Second, the Soviets followed up quickly by revealing their capability to build long-range jet bombers, particularly the Tu-95 Bear, capable of making the transpolar flight. The air defense buffer of the oceans had vanished overnight. Suddenly, the shortest route between Moscow and Washington was directly over the Arctic ice caps. The DEW line was conceived not as a defensive barrier, but as a technological tripwire. It was designed to detect the low-flying, massive Soviet bombers long before they reached the heavily populated centers of the North American continent. The concept was simple: a series of overlapping radar dishes, spaced roughly 50 to 100 miles apart, communicating instantaneously. The reality of building this infrastructure in the Arctic was anything but simple, demanding technological innovation and human endurance that tested the limits of engineering. The challenge was unprecedented. Construction crews had to work in permanent darkness, facing temperatures that routinely dropped to minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit, coupled with violent blizzards and permafrost that made digging foundations nearly impossible. The cost estimates soared immediately. This was not just a chain of radar stations. It was the construction of permanent, self-sufficient, nuclear-hardened communities in the middle of nowhere. The total cost of the project quickly ballooned into the realm of astronomical. At completion, the DEW line represented a $6 billion investment, well over $60 billion in today's currency, all dedicated to buying 3 hours of warning. This single project became a massive, visible, physical symbol of the paranoia and financial commitment that defined the domestic Cold War effort. The challenges of building the DEW line were not just financial, they were fundamentally geographic and meteorological. The Arctic is defined by permafrost, ground that is permanently frozen, which prevents any traditional foundation from being built. Digging into it is like drilling into rock, and if the permafrost melts, the entire structure shifts and collapses. The lack of infrastructure meant every single nail, beam, radar dish, and gallon of fuel, everything, had to be shipped thousands of miles, primarily by icebreaker ships or specialized, heavy-duty cargo planes. The planning for the logistics of the construction was itself a feat of Cold War military precision. The project required coordinating the efforts of the U.S. Air Force, the Royal Canadian Air Force, and dozens of civilian contractors across an area larger than Western Europe. Specialized architectural designs were created for the radar stations. These were not mere shacks, they were fully self-contained, insulated buildings built on stilts or massive pilings sunk deep into the permafrost to prevent the building's heat from melting the ground below. They were designed to survive sustained temperatures of minus 80 degrees and winds exceeding 100 miles per hour, functioning essentially as remote, nuclear-hardened fortresses. The heart of the system was the radar technology. Early warning radar of the time was powerful but bulky. The DEW line utilized huge rotating parabolic dishes and massive, low-frequency antenna systems, each site requiring vast amounts of power to transmit and receive signals over the massive distances. This required installing complete power generation facilities, usually diesel or nuclear reactors in later iterations, at every remote station, making each site a miniature isolated power grid though the construction season was brutally short, often lasting only 90 to 120 days during the brief Arctic summer, when the ice broke up enough to allow ships to deliver materials. Every contractor, every engineer, and every laborer, thousands of men, had to be flown in, housed, fed, and supplied for the entire year, often before the actual station was operational. The commitment was total, transforming tiny, remote settlements into temporary, bustling military outposts. The psychological toll on the workers was immense. Men endured months of isolation, the endless, crippling darkness of the Arctic winter, and the constant, unnerving pressure of knowing they were the first line of defense against a war that could end civilization. Their entire existence was dedicated to waiting for the electronic ghost of a Soviet bomber to appear on a radar screen, providing the only signal that the end had begun. This massive investment, therefore, was not just technological, it was a profound human sacrifice to the anxiety of the atomic age. The ultimate technological problem facing the DU Line engineers was the propagation of radio waves across the high latitudes. The electromagnetic environment near the North Pole is extremely hostile due to atmospheric disturbances and the intense auroral activity, which often interfered with conventional radar signals. This required developing and utilizing massive, specialized tropospheric scatter antennas. Instead of relying on line-of-sight transmission, these antennas bounced signals off the troposphere, allowing them to communicate reliably over distances of several hundred miles, linking the individual stations into a cohesive chain. The sheer technical difficulty meant that the DU Line was a financial black hole. Every piece of equipment, from the radar components to the plumbing, had to be engineered to operate reliably for months without human intervention in the extreme cold. This demanded new kinds of lubricants, hardened circuitry, and specialized materials that resisted the constant contraction and expansion caused by the wild temperature swings. The project became an unintended, massive R&D program for civilian technology. The civilian workers who built and maintained the DU Line were highly paid, often earning double or triple the wages of their counterparts in the lower 48. They were pioneers in harsh environment construction, relying on specialized vehicles like the Tucker Snowcat and massive helicopter fleets for site logistics. The cost of maintaining a single person at a remote site for a full year was astronomical, accounting for transportation, specialized housing, and provisions. The massive logistical footprint of the DU Line permanently altered the economic and cultural landscape of the Canadian and Alaskan North. It brought jobs, infrastructure, and an intense American military presence into territories that had previously been almost completely isolated. It created the initial infrastructure that would later be used for oil and gas exploration, but its primary impact was the sudden, overwhelming imposition of the Cold War onto the pristine Arctic environment. The public justification for the staggering cost was simple: fear. The FCDA and the military-industrial complex needed to constantly remind the American public of the impending Soviet bomber threat to justify the DU Line's existence. Newsreels and magazine articles frequently ran dramatized scenarios of silent Soviet bombers crossing the pole, only to be detected at the last possible moment by the vigilant radar watchmen. This constant public messaging fueled the civil defense movement in the suburbs, linking the lonely Arctic station to the frantic building of backyard shelters. The irony was that even as the DU Line was being completed in the late 1950s, the technology it was designed to combat was becoming obsolete. The Soviet Union's successful test of the ICBM and the launch of Sputnik in 1957 signaled the end of the bomber gap and the beginning of the missile gap. A missile traveling at Mach 20 offered only minutes of warning, rendering the DU Line's crucial 3-hour buffer irrelevant almost before the final radar dish was mounted. This shift forced the military to rapidly pivot their investment strategy. The DU Line, originally designed as the ultimate early warning system, became a lumbering relic in the face of hypervelocity missile technology. The U.S. immediately launched the development of the Ballistic Missile Early Warning System, (BUES), an even more technologically complex and vastly more expensive radar network designed to track missiles, not subsonic bombers. The DU Line had become an instant, multi-billion-dollar piece of obsolete history. The psychological impact of this rapid technological obsolescence was severe. The U.S. government had to simultaneously reassure the public that the DU Line was still valuable for detecting cruise missiles and subsonic attacks, while quietly accelerating the BMEU's program. The DO line became a symbol of American over-engineering and the constant, unnerving pressure of the Soviet Union's technological leapfrogging. The men who staffed the DO line stations were, in effect, the modern-day watchmen on the wall. They were a mix of military personnel and civilian contractors, working 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, their lives revolving around the constant, silent monitoring of a radar screen in a windowless room. Their only mandate was to detect an intrusion and press the button that would initiate the cascade of warning messages flowing south to the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, headquarters deep inside Cheyenne Mountain. The isolation was extreme. The typical crew size was small, ranging from 10 to 30 people, cut off from the outside world by weather and distance for months at a time. To combat the profound psychological effects of the isolation, lack of sunlight, and monotonous work, the stations were equipped with amenities that seemed lavish in the 1950s, large recreational areas, well-stocked libraries, and continuous, high-quality food service. These were, quite literally, gilded cages designed to keep the watchmen sane and alert. The greatest threat to the DO line was not a Soviet bomber, but boredom and false alarms. The radar screens were often filled with clutter caused by weather, flocks of migratory birds, or the very atmospheric conditions the systems were designed to operate in. Each false signal, however, required the same intense level of verification and response, placing immense stress on the crews. The sheer pressure of knowing that one missed signal meant national catastrophe created an environment of high-strung, perpetual vigilance. The protocols for a verified warning were drastic. The initial DO line alert would launch a chain reaction. SAIC bombers would scramble into the air, the fail-safe maneuver. City sirens would blare across the entire continent, and the population would be instructed to take shelter immediately. The DO line was the first step in a sequence that terminated in nuclear war, giving the isolated crew members an incredible, terrifying level of responsibility. The technological obsolescence of the DO line accelerated the strategic pivot toward ICBMs and submarines. The realization that the system was inadequate for missiles forced the U.S. to rapidly embrace a retaliatory strategy rather than a defensive one. If warning time was reduced to minutes, the priority shifted from sheltering the population to ensuring the enemy was destroyed in response. This marked the definitive institutional embrace of mutually assured destruction, MAD. The DO line's legacy, however, is not entirely one of failure. While it was never effective against the missile threat, it proved invaluable in the less glamorous fields of Arctic communications and infrastructure. The communication network built to support the radar stations, a massive radio and satellite relay system, became the foundation for modern civilian communication across the Canadian North and Alaska. It enabled weather forecasting, air traffic control, and scientific research in the region long after the immediate bomber threat had faded. The DO line also served a crucial political function. It was the first major international collaboration between the U.S. and Canada on joint continental defense. This partnership led directly to the creation of NORAD, North American Air Defense Command, in 1958, integrating the air defense systems of both nations into a single command structure. The physical line of radar dishes cemented the military and political alliance across the continent. The maintenance of the DO line through the 1960s became a financial and political burden. The stations required constant, expensive upkeep against the destructive forces of the Arctic. Over the decades, many stations were closed, modernized, or completely automated. The program transitioned from being a symbol of frantic, hand-built defense to a quiet, technologically managed infrastructure project. The environmental cost of the DO line proved to be another critical, long-term consequence that the 1950s planners completely overlooked. The rapid construction, reliance on diesel generators, and the vast amount of construction materials and fuel dumped or abandoned in the Arctic resulted in significant environmental contamination. The extreme cold preserved the toxins, making cleanup a massive, long-term government burden for both Canada and the U.S. Decades later, the cleanup of the abandoned DO line sites became a billion-dollar environmental project, a painful realization of the hidden cost of Cold War urgency. The remnants of the $6 billion panic button were abandoned diesel drums, buried toxins, and rusting metal, a physical reminder of the recklessness of the initial construction phase. The DEW line also played a subtle, enduring role in Cold War intelligence by forcing the Soviet Union into a costly technological response. Knowing that the U.S. was building a sophisticated bomber detection system, the Soviets diverted vast resources into developing countermeasures, including terrain-hugging cruise missiles and advanced electronic jamming techniques. The Soviet decision to prioritize ICBMs over long-range bombers was heavily influenced by the existence of the DEW line. Demonstrating that even an obsolete defense system could achieve a strategic purpose, the cultural yield of the DEW line was the image of the isolated sentry, the dedicated military man standing guard in the eternal darkness. This archetype became a powerful symbol in Cold War literature and film, representing the quiet, relentless vigilance required to maintain freedom. This image helped sell the idea of the Cold War to the American public, creating a romanticized vision of the man who stood alone against the invisible threat. The ultimate yield of the DEW line was not the 3 hours of warning it was designed to provide, but the stabilization of the American psyche during the most volatile period of the nuclear age. It gave Eisenhower and his successors the confidence to conduct foreign policy without the fear of a totally blind first strike, and it gave the American public a tangible, physical assurance, a line drawn in the ice, that the government was actively protecting them. The project stands as one of the most expensive and ambitious peacetime construction efforts in American history, an industrial marvel that was technologically obsolete before it was even fully operational. It perfectly encapsulates the urgency, the paranoia, and the boundless financial commitment that defined the domestic Cold War. The DEW line was the ultimate $6 billion panic button, pressed by a nation that desperately needed to buy time and peace of mind. The lonely, abandoned radar stations across the Arctic Circle are a lasting, silent monument to the nuclear terror of the 1950s. They are the physical scars left on the continent by the Cold War's frantic technological race. They stand as a powerful reminder that the innovations and anxieties of yesterday's yield often endure long after the immediate threat has faded. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of history. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Yesterday's Yield for more untold stories of the Cold War, and let us know in the comments below. Would you rather have staffed a DEW line station in 1958 or worked in the Kremlin decoding intelligence?